In today's history video, let's focus on the onset of the Great Depression and the Hoover administration. And my commentary today is heavily influenced by a sort of revisionist history of the United States in the 20th century that was written by David Stockman, the book entitled The Great Deformation. And he really makes the case, which had previously been made by Herbert Hoover himself and therefore not seen as very credible, that the Great Depression was on the verge of being solved by the end of the Hoover presidency. The crash itself came in October of 1929, about 6 months after Hoover took office, and it was monumental. The gross domestic product of the United States, which in this Great Recession has grown by only 2% a year, actually fell by 50%. Literally, it fell from 100 billion to 50 billion between 1929 and 1933. This order of magnitude that dwarfs anything we've been confronted with now. The unemployment rate was into the 20s. And Hoover's approach was essentially the approach of most Republicans at that point, which was to leave it alone and let the economy adjust on its own. Liquidate all the bad loans, all the bad investments, all the bad companies that had been set up, lay off the workers, close the companies, and then rebuild and hire them back with good companies and good investments after the bad stuff had been pruned away. In Stockman's view, the cause of the Depression was that the United States in World War I became the granary and the armory of the world. U.S. production soared. And because the United States was largely unaffected by the war, 100,000 dead, but no fighting on our soil, the United States found the war to be a tremendous growth process, whereas Britain, that was drained of manpower, and France and Germany, that were torn apart, no longer really could become international competitors. They didn't have the industry, they didn't have the manpower, they didn't have the capital. So that during the 20s, the United States was by far the dominant economic power in the world. Britain secondary, but still second to the United States. And the U.S. financed the purchase of its products by foreigners by lending them money. Wall Street sold $10 billion in foreign bonds that gave France and Britain and Germany the money to buy American products. When the stock market crashed, basically just due to over-speculation, a regular boom-bust cycle, those foreign bonds dried up. And at the same time, the Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff that raised rates and set up protectionist barriers to exports and imports to the United States. As a result, the total of exports by America dropped from about $5.5 trillion to about $1.5 billion. Billion meant something in those days. From $5.5 billion to $1.5 billion in 3 years. Just absolutely wiped out the export sector, which in turn wiped out the car industry and all of the major industrial industries that had powered the boom of the 1920s, essentially withdrawing the United States from the world, where it was the world economy that propped us up during the 20s, put the United States in a terrible position. But the deleveraging, the liquidating process went ahead ruthlessly, unchecked by anything and unaided by any safety net or unemployment insurance. But by July of 1932, there was a definite uptick in all of the economy's measurements. The stock market regained about 80% of its value. Gross domestic product began to rise at about 4% a year, which was a pretty good growth rate. And there were all kinds of indications of a major return of the American economy. The banking failures had largely been confined during the Depression to small rural banks, not the major financial centers. And those continued, but they too had run their course, and the bad banks were essentially out of business. So what happened? Well, in 1933, everything went to pot. The recovery stopped, the Depression came back, and bank failures soared. The reason, Stockman says, is that FDR was in this limbo period between November when he was elected and March when he would take office. And he kept sending signals that the United States would pursue inflation as the remedy. we were stuck with massive deflation during the Depression. And they said that he might take the U.S. off the gold standard. He might go to a silver standard, as William Jennings Bryan had urged 40 years before, and he would basically inflate the currency. That led to a dry up of investment, a lack of confidence, and runs on the banks. Because if you took us off the gold standard, you could no longer bring your dollar in and get $1 worth of gold, or 40 cents on the dollar, which the law then allowed. And as a result, people began running to the banks to take out their gold and take out currency as fast as they could, and then redeem the gold while you still could, because of the fear that Roosevelt would stop that. And this all became a critical situation when there was a bank failure in Detroit, brought about really by the crash of the car industry during this period, and the personality of Henry Ford contributed to it. And that led to a panic soaring throughout the country that reached its fever pitch when Roosevelt was sworn in as president. Hoover had pleaded with Roosevelt to issue some statement that he would not inflate the economy, and history has treated that as being a phony entreaty in an effort to tie Roosevelt up in Hoover policies. But Stockman makes the point that it was a vital necessity, and Roosevelt's failure to do that caused the banking crisis. We'll talk about how the New Deal dealt with all this, and again, the overstatement that history gives the New Deal as the solution to the Great Depression. We'll go into all of this with tremendous relevance to our times, as you can see. Thanks for watching.